I should emphasize that I am not a prepper, and I don't consider for myself a self-sufficient pantry to be a pantry that is packed to the brim. Rather, I see self-sufficiency as a mindset that empowers me to manage the day-to-day, and in this case, knowing how to stock my pantry to meet my daily needs. The first step for creating a self-sufficient pantry is knowing what you will and will not eat and how quickly you will move through those items. So for example, we eat a lot of pasta and rice, so I always have pasta on hand, and then I always buy big 25-pound bags of rice from Sam's or Costco. But oatmeal, for example, we just don't eat a lot of, so I only buy it in small batches. And quite possibly, knowing what your family doesn't eat or what you can't get through in a reasonable amount of time is more important than knowing what you do. Because obviously, the things that you and your family enjoy, you're going to cook and get through, but the things that maybe you're imagining you want to eat more of end up sitting around, taking space, and possibly can go to waste. But when the pantry is packed to the brim with things that are random or that you don't enjoy, it's less intuitive. And from my perspective, the pantry should feel familiar when you open it. You should feel like you intuitively know what to do with the food you have. That's not to say you can't try new ingredients here and there, but the self-sufficient pantry isn't one that's filled with bulk items that you just don't use. One way that I try to increase the mileage out of what I have in my pantry is to pick things that serve multiple purposes or that can be used in different ways. And a good example of this in my pantry is grits. I actually have a really delicious Southern cheese grits recipe over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com, so be sure to check that out. But for many years, I used regular store-bought grits, not the instant kind, but the regular kind that you cook. And they taste good, but the thing about them is they can really only be used for making grits or polenta. But when you mill your own corn, you actually get multiple ingredients from that, because when you mill corn, for example, you have to sift it. And when you sift it, you have corn flour that can be used for cornbread, and then you have a coarser grit that can be used, of course, for cheese grits. So by keeping one ingredient in my pantry, I actually get multiple purposes out of it. So I'm trying to always think of ways that I can stock my pantry with items where I can use it in multiple ways, because it's a better bang for my buck, but also you save money that way and you don't have to keep as much stuff in your pantry. Now, one of my favorite things to do is to can food and make my own pantry staples, and I'm going to show you how to pressure can dry beans in just a couple minutes. But first, I want to talk a little bit about pantry organization. One of the reasons I often underscore that the pantry doesn't have to be packed to the brim is because we don't have a ton of pantry space. Now, we don't have a tiny pantry, but we don't have a homestead pantry. We don't have a cellar or anything like that. And sometimes if I have too much stuff in my pantry and I open the door, it's really stressful. And the better option feels like closing the door and going to get takeout or going to a restaurant. But when your pantry is organized, it's a lot easier, of course, to see what's in there, but also it clears the mental space so you know what to do with that stuff. So one of the things that I am doing, which I didn't plan on doing until I opened my pantry to film this, is I am cleaning out my pantry and turning one of our closets into a backup pantry. So the first thing I'm doing to be able to clear out some space in my pantry is I am restocking any of my containers that are low. And this is something I recommend doing all the time, just because it's really irritating when you're halfway through a recipe and you don't have what you need in the container and then you have to refill it. So whenever you notice something is low, just go ahead and refill it. But where I run into some issues sometimes is then I still have this like big 25-pound bag of flour from Azure, for example, that's really in the way in my pantry. So one of the things that I recommend for the self-sufficient pantry is to have places to put your back stock. So if you're buying things in bulk, you don't have to keep all of that in your pantry. You can stash it in a cabinet. You can stash it in an extra closet. Anywhere that you have a little space to store those things, I recommend doing that. But I do caution you not to use that extra space to stash stuff that you're never going to use. So I don't recommend buying things, like I mentioned in the beginning, that you think you might use and then filling up precious closet space with that. If you are going to use extra space in your house for a backup pantry, make sure you're filling it with vital ingredients, the things that you know you're going to use, the things that you can't live without. Because at the end, you don't want a closet full of things that you're never going to use. You want a closet that you will utilize all the time. I'll show you my backup pantry and how I organize that in just a second. But in case you're wondering what I'm doing, here I am recipe testing some sourdough brioche rolls. And these are really good, by the way. But the thing that I want to underscore here about keeping things like flour and bread baking supplies on hand is that you can make your own pantry staples with bread. So, for instance, rather than keeping boxes of breadcrumbs on hand, you can make your own bread and turn those into breadcrumbs. I often just make bread and then freeze it. And when I have enough, I make breadcrumbs with it. Or if you have fresh bread on hand, you can toast it up and use it as croutons. So, doing things like that clears space out of your pantry, but it also incorporates more scratch made nutritious food into your daily repertoire. Sometimes I imagine if a person opens my pantry door, they're like, cool, you have flour and salt and a little bit of sourdough starter in your fridge. You can make basically nothing with that. But what I see is not just bread, but I also see pancakes and waffles and flatbreads and rolls and breadcrumbs and croutons, all sorts of different foods that I can make with just a couple pantry staples. So you don't have to have a year's worth of bread on hand in the freezer. You don't have to have all these things pre-made all the time. As long as you have the right ingredients and the knowledge to make them, you can have just about anything with just a few pantry staples. Okay, let's get back to the backup pantry. So, up at the front of our house in I call it the foyer, it's really just like a basic entryway. We have a coat closet that has basically just been storage. And then for spring, we cleaned it out, and that's where we started our seeds and had our shelves with grow lights in there for all of our garden seeds. So, I am taking these grow lights out. But one of the things I want to note is that this wire rack was only $25 at Sam's Club. So, getting shelving doesn't have to be expensive. Your pantry and your backup pantry doesn't have to be some aesthetic thing. It just needs to be functional. So I am putting all my backup on these shelves and I can roll it right out of the closet and into my pantry. Now I am putting things like bags of flour on the bottom because if they fall, it's a little less catastrophic that way. So big heavy bags of flour put on the bottom. And then as you move up, you can put things there that maybe if they fall, it won't be a big deal. And always keeping glass jars on the bottom too if you are pushing that around. But for this, I am putting anything from my pantry that is excess. So a lot of my grains I buy in 25-pound bags and it fills up 2 buckets. I don't need 2 buckets of each grain in my regular pantry. So I'm putting that back stock on those shelves. Now, for me, milling grains is both something I do for regular old baking and cooking, but it's also a hobby. So you don't really have to keep that many grains around. If you can only choose one grain to keep in your pantry, I would definitely choose a hard white wheat because it's a little more versatile. But if you have space for more, I would recommend a hard wheat and a soft wheat. But no matter what, whatever those ingredients are that you use all the time, whether it's flour, wheat berries, maybe it's something totally different, I do recommend getting them in bulk when possible so you always have them on hand. I don't believe that a self-sufficient pantry needs to be bursting at the seams with food, but I do think it's helpful when it contains extras of your most used items. Now, going back to what I said earlier when I was talking about making sourdough, that you can use it to make your own pantry staples, one of the best parts, at least in my opinion, of the self-sufficient pantry is stocking it with scratch-made pantry staples. We don't use a ton of canned foods in our house. I definitely keep things like spaghetti sauce on hand. Sometimes I have like coconut milk or tomato paste, those sorts of things. But for the most part, if I have canned foods in the pantry, they are home canned. Now, I do understand that canning is not the food preservation method for everyone. There are lots of different ways to preserve food, but canning for me is really fun. I enjoy the process and I love the end result. So I want to share with you how to pressure can dry beans because you can get big bags of dry beans at Sam's Club, for example, for just a couple bucks. And then if you pressure can them, you now have cooked, ready to go beans in your pantry. To can dry beans, you simply just soak. I think I used 4 pounds of dry beans. So you soak them for about 12 to 18 hours, then drain the water and then put them in a pot, fill it with water and bring them to a boil and let it boil for 30 minutes. Then all you do is fill your jars with beans and then top them off with some of the cooking liquid or boiling water. Now, one thing I want to mention about canning beans that I learned the hard way that I feel like no one mentions enough is that those beans absorb a lot of the liquid. So when you're canning them, only fill the jars about 2/3 of the way full or so with the beans and let the rest be liquid because they're going to soak up that liquid while they cook and they're going to soak up that liquid in storage too. So you want to have more liquid than beans in the jar. Beans have to be pressure canned because they are a low acidity food. So foods with high acid can be water bath canned. Foods with low acid need to be pressure canned. So I pressure can these at 11 pounds of pressure for 75 minutes because I am at sea level. You should read your manufacturer instructions and also check out the instructions over on the National Center for Home Food Preservation for safe canning practices for your elevation. I'll have the full instructions and recipe for canning dried beans over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com soon. I think it'll be out in a week or so. So there'll be a link in the description box that will take you there or tell you when it will be available. And I really like preserving my own food and making my own pantry staples because sometimes those canned foods from the store have some funky things in the liners, things that I'm not super pumped about giving to my family. So I like knowing exactly what is in the food I'm storing in my pantry. Now, when I preserve food, I tend to do really big batches. So during food preservation season, for example, I freeze dry and can about a year's worth of tomatoes and a year's worth of salsa and a year's worth of peaches. So for my pantry, I keep them on these short little rolly carts and I put them in my pantry underneath the main shelves. And what I like to do is make sure every once in a while I pull everything out, make sure the seals are still good, but then also shift things around so we know what to use. I just heard my husband the other day tell my daughter he wasn't sure if we had peaches, and we actually have a ton of cans of peaches. They were just kind of shoved in the back. So if you just make sure that you're shifting things around in your pantry, you'll be able to get through them and you'll know what is there. Now, in terms of vegetable storage, I don't keep a whole lot in my pantry, of course, because a lot of things go in the fridge, but I do try to keep things on hand that last a long time. Like onions, for example, we buy a 10-pound bag once a month from Azure, and that's enough to get us through. And then I also grow my own sweet potatoes, and we keep those in the pantry. So I always like to think about what veggies can I keep in my pantry that last a really long time. Onions, potatoes, sweet potatoes, those are all good choices. And what's kind of funny is once I got everything cleaned out and then restocked, my containers filled, and my backup pantry set up, everything looks really sparse. When I first started this video, my pantry was kind of a mess. In fact, I didn't even want to show it on video because it was too disorganized. But now everything is pretty tidy and it also looks a little bit empty. So like I keep saying, the well-stocked, self-sufficient pantry doesn't have to be packed to the brim. It only needs the things that you are going to use. For me, I'm not like a pre-made food person. I keep tons of ingredients on hand. So it looks like there's not much in here, but I see tons of possibilities. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and to sign up for the email list. When you do, I will send you links to all my videos, recipes, blog post tutorials, and more directly to your inbox. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.